in my own, what was important to me emotionally, taking that lesson from that brother was the way we think about history is different. The way we experience it is different. What is the whole book to some of us is just a chapter to other people, and vice versa. And what really mattered was the ritual, the idea that the place by itself really didn't matter. What mattered was how we choose to incorporate it, use it, share knowledge, bring next generations to it to impart lessons, whatever those lessons happen to be. So when we talk about memorials and remembering, it's important to know that memory is not the same as history. How we choose to remember things is not, in some cases, doesn't have anything to do with what actually happened. And what we're experiencing now with regards to the removal of significant historical events, I think, this past week alone, the removal of Jackie Robinson and Medgar Evers from any kind of record showing their military service under the auspices of DEI, the closing of institutions, the defunding of other ones. It's clear that we don't all see history the same way. And some people are using memory as a weapon. And so, in this case, the public spaces, the environment that we inhabit, also play a role in sharing these stories that we pass to one another. In the introduction, Ababa Kazi shared, it's true, I'm from Michigan, I'm from Detroit, and I had a totally different view of the South before I moved down here. Uh, when I was in the North, I never even thought about the Civil War at all. You know, in our mind up North, the Union won, the Confederates lost, that's that. There were no Confederate monuments, no streets named after Confederates in Detroit, none of that stuff. It was coming down here that I started to understand that a lot of that legacy that we thought was gone is still alive. And this image is real in terms of a Confederate soldier using a young black man, enslaved young black man, as a seat. And so to visually communicate, the fact that we were not considered human, we were considered property, and without us, there would be no United States because we were the unpaid labor for centuries that built these colonies. And it was true when I moved to North Carolina. This is the cover of Independent Weekly, a progressive newspaper that's based in Durham. And on the left, you can see that this is actually the Capitol grounds in Raleigh, where that picture is taken. The two young sisters there, on their phones, seeing a Civil War reenactor and looking at him like he's crazy. And so a lot of us kind of felt that way in that period of time. We didn't fully understand the power of these particular symbols. And what I often talk about with my students, that image on the right is a very famous picture from Alabama that was taken by the photographer Gordon Parks. Is that if you just looked at the bottom of that picture and just saw, a black woman, her child on the street carrying themselves with dignity and grace in the built environment, you would think that that was a really good scene and that was really good history. But we've all had to live in the shadow of policies, sometimes not in the shadow, but in our face. So this idea that some of these symbols that we take for granted, that we ignore every day, that we quite frankly are blind to, are actually impacting how we move and how we feel comfort and how much we feel like we belong in the place. And so that's what led to this book. And so the rest of this lecture is about this book that I co-edited with a colleague, Ellen Deming, about the aftermath of the takedown of Confederate monuments across the South. What happened next, and how can communities work towards a process of healing and elevating the stories of those that we didn't know previously. For historical context, this is one of the early census maps in the United States. It was done in 1860. It showed the enslaved African population in the southern states, which eventually become the Confederate States, which seceded from the United States. What's interesting about this map is the darker the color, the higher the population of enslaved African people. And you can see generally in the Mississippi River going down through Louisiana to New Orleans. You can see the Black Belt represented in the middle, going across Alabama and Georgia to South Carolina in concentrations down near Charleston, then up into Virginia. And so this map from 1860 is eerily similar to our current racial distribution in the American South, which is to say, the areas that had the highest enslaved African populations in 1860 are still the areas that have the highest Black population in the United States today. In 1860, at least in our state, in North Carolina, 1 in 3 people, even though African American people were not considered people at that time, 1 in 3 people were enslaved. And that number is much higher when you get into places like Mississippi and Alabama and other places. So a lot of where we are now is really still shaped by that. Civil War, the end of the Civil War, the aftermath of the Civil War. And so this image, which is in Charleston, shows the level of devastation that occurred in the South, particularly when General Sherman and his march to the sea leveled entire communities. What was interesting about it was the reactions of different communities. Black people started to, for Union soldiers that were dead or killed in battle, started to, on their own, as a show of grace and appreciation and humanity, bury them. Those are the early origins of Memorial Day in the United States, was the actions of formerly enslaved African people showing their respect for Union soldiers who in part fought to liberate them. Reconstruction occurs much later. The the creation of civil rights laws, the amendments to the Constitution, the Freedmen's Bank, a lot of things that in a short period of time were created with the intent of how do you bring a number of people into the American society, the first election of senators and representatives from multiple states in the 41st and 42nd Congress. This is from 1872. These are people who served uh, even then from states like Mississippi and South Carolina and many other places. But the white community at that time, particularly women who were either daughters or mothers or wives or otherwise related to Confederate soldiers who have fallen, began interring their dead, right? So Confederate soldiers that were there. And it's also important to note that uh, Confederates were given a pardon after the end of the Civil War. They're allowed to return to civil society. They were never prosecuted, punished, anything for secession, for treason, for the harm that they did to the Union. So they were allowed to go back into society. And so at that time, what started with a process of interring the dead, the Confederates, turned into how do we start to also honor the Confederacy as a legitimate movement and not something that was really traitorous and about secession. And so this is where memory and history start to shift and it starts to grow into memorialization. It started with burials, and here the daughters of the American Daughters of the Confederacy, excuse me, is a significant organization with regards to where Confederate monuments came from. The first ones were in Kentucky and in cemeteries, so they were not necessarily in public spaces. They were in the private spaces for internment. But that changed. And one of the reasons why it changed was formerly people came from the southern states in the Confederacy, started to go to institutions, and were trying to find ways to keep those stories alive. They resented being thought of as traitors, being thought of as people who seceded, people who did harm. They saw themselves as heroic, even saintly. And so Pollard, who went to Yale, came up with what's known as the tenets of the lost cause. This was published in a newspaper first, then a journal article, and then was rapidly circulated right around the end of the 19th century and the early 20th century, and really started to talk about uh, distorting and changing the story of the Civil War and the role of the Confederacy to do intentional harm generations later. These are 6 of the tenets. The first one, secession, not slavery, caused the Civil War. Second one, African Americans were faithful slaves, loyal to their masters in the Confederate cause and unprepared for the responsibilities of freedom. The third, the Confederacy was defeated militarily only because of the Union's overwhelming advantages in men and resources. The fourth one, Confederate soldiers were heroic and saintly. The fifth one, the most heroic and saintly of all Confederates, perhaps all Americans, was Robert E. Lee. And six, Southern women were loyal to the Confederate cause and sanctified by the sacrifice of their loved ones. So, as one part of the country was working on how to expand rights, how to expand ways of encouraging people to come in, there was a whole other counter movement going on that was rewriting the history that just occurred. This diagram comes from the book, but it starts to talk about the proliferation of Confederate monuments at that time. The bottom, so if you look at the bottom of the screen, the longer the lines, the more Confederate monuments occur. So when we start our clock, right around here is the end of the Civil War. You can see the highest spike is not at the direct end of the Civil War. It's in the early 1910s and 1920s, in the Jim Crow era, when African Americans were trying to fight for their rights, to protect institutions, to establish towns, to migrate to different places. And these spikes, in terms of the creation of these Confederate monuments, occur in alignment with things that were about the civil rights of African American and Black people. High points in the civil rights movement, the passing of the Civil Rights Act, you see these spikes over and over and over again. Red Summer, when Birth of a Nation, which we'll talk about in a second, came out. So these monuments proliferated at every crossroads when Black people were trying to get more civil rights and be recognized as whole people and citizens of the United States, not just in the aftermath of the Civil War. When we talk about the numbers in terms of how many of these are, we know that, particularly in 2020, we saw a lot in real time in the news, a lot of them coming down, but many, many still remain. Of those that we classify as monuments, there's still almost 900 monuments that still stand. And not just in the Southeast, there are monuments in California, in New York, in Ohio, in Indiana, and many places that weren't even a part of the Confederacy that still stand. And what these maps show as well is that it wasn't just monuments. There were buildings named after these people all over the country. There are roads, there are schools, there are counties, and there are other parts of the infrastructure. So what we're talking about is not just monuments. We're talking about 3,000 pieces of the built environment that were meant to give a symbol to the lost cause, which is a false narrative of why we fought. The importance of Birth of a Nation can't be understated. Um, D.W. Griffith's movie, based on the book, which preceded it, which was also very popular, occurred after there was a decline in Ku Klux Klan activity. Matter of fact, there were uh, federal protections and laws that were attempting to control and suppressing the Ku Klux Klan. There really wasn't much activity regarding that. But when that book turned into a film, this became what we call the first blockbuster in American movie history. In its day, it was the equivalent to the biggest Marvel movie today in terms of how many people saw it. It was a huge movie. And the crux of it was, again, the tenets of the lost cause that Black people were incapable of freedom and governing themselves and needed to be controlled. And in this image, you see a white man in blackface playing a Black man who was accused of raping a white woman. And therefore, the actions of the Ku Klux Klan were justified. Not just Confederate soldiers, but now the Ku Klux Klan is included as a heroic, righteous uh, response to the fact that Black people and African Americans could not be controlled. It was the first movie screened in the White House. The president at that time, Woodrow Wilson, required the entire cabinet and the entire Supreme Court to watch it in 1915. The white men were roused by a mere instinct of self-preservation in his description of the Ku Klux Klan. At the time, this is the president, just to remind you. To that last, there had sprung into existence a great Ku Klux Klan, a veritable empire at the South to protect the Southern country. So those were words strictly from the president, with the cabinet and with the Supreme Court. And this led to a massive resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan in the United States and the largest Confederate monument in the world, Stone Mountain. So this gets us to the title of this talk, Deliberate Forgetting. That word comes from one of the directors of the International African American Museum, which recently opened in Charleston, South Carolina, and how the public memory, not Black folks, white folks, and the broader mainstream community, their vision of the South, the antebellum South, is pretty much gone with the wind. Where when people think about that era, they don't really think about enslavement and the torture of our ancestors. They think about beautiful gardens. They think about big houses. They think about people who worked the land and somehow had a righteous peace. And this is to explain why places like plantations are very popular for weddings and receptions and other gatherings is that there's this filter and this lens that prevents people from understanding the horrible crimes and atrocities that occurred in those places. With regards to us and with regards to monuments, things changed, and two important events. Bree Newsom taking down the Confederate flag from the State House grounds in 2015. And later Dylan Roof, who in 2017 murdered in cold blood dozens of Black people parishioners in Mother Bethel in Charleston, South Carolina. In response to that, people started to look at Confederate monuments differently. And this is where I jump in on this because up to this point, I hadn't really paid attention to them. I suffered from the same blindness that other people did, but they occurred in the three communities in the Research Triangle region where I live. So Durham, where I live on the left, which we'll talk about, Raleigh, where I work, our state capital, and Chapel Hill. And that one, Silent Sam, is on the University of North Carolina campus, or at least was. We'll talk about how that occurred. In the aftermath of Bree Newsom climbing the flagpole in South Carolina, the state of North Carolina changed the Constitution to protect this particular Confederate monument on the state capitol grounds, commemorated to our Confederate dead. So that even the use of that language, our Confederate dead, suggests to you who they were speaking to and how they thought about it. They changed the Constitution right after that act occurred to make it a felony to change anything or to face anything on the Capitol grounds to protect this particular monument. So they did a preemptive strike to change the rules to make anything affecting that punishable. The next major event, which we all know, in Charlottesville, with the Unite the Right rally and the horrible aftermath of that, resulting in the death and the injury of many people. In the aftermath of that, Silent Sam, silent as the silent century, that is what that word means. This was not a unique sculpture about Confederate monuments. This was a pattern, sort of a cast. You could get this figure cast and replicate it and placed in many different places. But Silent Sam, as in the silent century, watching until it's time to reactivate, has been on UNC's campus for decades and was the target of uh, criticism, action, request for removal by Black students as early as there were Black students at UNC. For people who don't know that these monuments were intentional and used to intimidate our communities, this is a quote at the dedication of Silent Sam at UNC. And so we'll go through it. I trust I may be pardoned for one allusion, howbeit it is rather personal, 100 yards from where we stand, less than 90 days perhaps after my return from Appomattox. I horsewhipped a Negro wench until her skirts hung in shreds because upon the streets of this quiet village, she had publicly insulted and maligned a Southern lady and then rushed for protection to these university buildings where was stationed a garrison of 100 federal soldiers. I performed a pleasing duty in the immediate presence of the entire garrison and for 30 nights afterwards slept with a double-barrel shotgun under my head. That's Julian Carr. Julian Carr is a prominent individual in North Carolina history. This is literally from the speech where they unveiled Silent Sam. And so this idea of intentional racial intimidation with these sculptures is in the record. UNC's response was not to remove it, but to offer a counter memorial, a memorial for the people. So on the left, you can see Silent Sam staring at Franklin Street. And in the lower right, you can see what was known as the memorial to the unsung founders. A number of Black students on campus had done research and talked about how enslaved African labor contributed to the construction and the birth of UNC Chapel Hill. They commissioned an artist to come up with a sculpture associated with it. The memorial to the unsung founders has always been controversial. You can see the smaller figures holding up a giant table. And so the total mass of those figures is supposed to represent collective spirit, but it's also the exact shape and size for a footrest, which is how most students use it. So the memorial that was conceived as a way to recognize the contributions of Black people to the university is essentially a footstool for UNC students. and ever since its founding, it's been controversial. Maya Little was a history PhD student at UNC Chapel Hill and led the latest round of protests against Silent Sam. The blood that you see on that monument was blood that she got from pigs and threw on the monument. And at the time that Silent Sam stood, they spent over $300,000 a year on cleaning up vandalism on that monument. But you can see how it was pulled down by Maya and other students in protest. Required 24 hours police protection to keep her from being defaced. There was a major controversy at UNC Chapel Hill's campus about what to do with it. Their initial move was to pay $3.5 million to create a museum to protect this monument and remove it from the site. But that proposal was removed after outrage in this local community. And then Chancellor Carol Fulton, her last act as chancellor before she resigned, was the removal of Silent Sam and hiding it. And no one knows where it is to this day. In Durham, where I live, after the Unite the Right uh, protests in Charlottesville, there was a rumor that Unite the Right was coming to Durham. And so counter protesters, about 20,000 of them, came to face them. Unite the Right never showed up, but while they were all there, they tore down the Confederate monument in front of the county courthouse, just a block away from Black Wall Street. And so this is another bit of racial intimidation. One of the original Black Wall Streets in the United States was in Durham. It was the place where it's Paris Street, where NC Mutual Life and Mechanics and Farmers Bank were both founded. And at the time of their founding, they were the largest and most prosperous Black-owned businesses in the United States. This monument was a block away and staring right at that street. So you can see the protesters, after they pulled it down, all of this was on live television. Multiple police officers, nobody was hiding their identity or any of that stuff. But in that case, they did charge everyone, but they dropped all the cases for toppling that monument. And today that monument is gone. There's no evidence it was ever there. So in these different examples, that's what was getting us interested was the level of agency, the conflict, the fact that everybody kind of picked on those. And so we were just looking in our own backyard in North Carolina, but then we started to look around and see that it wasn't just in our own backyard, it was everywhere. So on the left in this slide, you can see the unveiling of the Robert E. Lee Memorial in Richmond, Virginia, um, the largest one outside of Stone Mountain in Georgia. On the right, you can see what happened right after the murder of George Floyd, the defacing of the monument, the projection of the monument, the use of that site as an organizing location. And today that monument is completely gone. It had been completely removed. And when we were looking at it, we reached out to a lot of people who have been thinking about it for a long period of time. And we tried to lean in Black designers, architects, landscape architects, historians, and others who are engaged in this moment and who had different attitudes to offer to help us. And so the end of this talk is just going to go through some of the cases that they have prepared. These are the people who, after these monuments came down, leapt into that gap to talk about how to use those spaces in new ways to empower communities and to elevate the voices of Black people in other communities that were suppressed by these Confederate monuments. In New Orleans, Sue Mobley and Brian Lee Jr. Led an effort called Paper Monuments. Former New Orleans Mayor Mitchell Andrew gave us permission to republish the speech that he gave after he took down a number of Confederate monuments around New Orleans and explained why he chose to do that. But after those were removed, Brian and Sue went back to those places where those monuments used to be and started to convene community conversations with people to talk about the stories that were in the community but were suppressed by those monuments and started to uncover all of these amazing stories ranging from people who lived there, significant events, and started to use more of a political action strategy of generating posters, political action posters, to talk about what could replace those monuments. So if you were in New Orleans right after the Confederate monuments came down, you might walk around different parts of the community, you'd start to see a number of stories of people from there that could start to inform the creation of new monuments, new elements that could tell the story of a truer story and a more balanced story of what New Orleans is really about. In Washington, and Dayton Schrader, an architect for a firm called Smith Group, took the idea of Confederate monuments and the oppression that that represented and translated it into more contemporary issues, particularly the police murder of Black people. And in this monument, he talked about how do you represent that pattern and have an emotional response. So he took the data of mass incarceration, lynchings, death by police, and turned it into a three-dimensional shape that you occupy, right? So basically, what that lady is dancing in is a three-dimensional graph of police violence against Black people. Its first location was on the National Mall. And in that, there are QR codes or stuff on the ground that help you understand the stories that are important to connect you to the data. It's also unique because it's a mobile monument. It has a website and you can order it and have it delivered wherever you want, and they'll set it up. So it started on the National Mall. It went on to Tulsa, Oklahoma, to help honor and uh, commemorate the tragic destruction of the Greenwood District in 2021. And it's been in many different places. But this idea that two parts, that there are contemporary trends that are just as destructive to our communities that need to be voiced and heard, contemporary atrocities like police murder, but also that maybe a monument isn't in a fixed location all the time, that it can move to the people, it can move to the community, it can move to the issue at hand. That's something that Dayton put on the table. And in other cases, there are other crimes that have been committed against our communities. One is urban renewal and the loss and destruction of our communities in the mid 20th century for freeway construction, for development, for other elements. And so this image comes to us from Greenville, North Carolina. And this is a former Black community and neighborhood that was destroyed during the urban renewal era for the creation of a park. Uh, uh, and the dislocation of these folks. In the far corner on the left, you can see a church bell tower. And so we'll come back to that church in a second. This comes to us from Zena Howard, who was one of the architects of the Smithsonian Museum of African American History, who engages in what's known as remembrance design. And so, although the park exists, there's still an opportunity to commemorate and give a place for people from that church parish to come back and have contact with that place and to remember collectively what that was. So Zena envisioned essentially an outdoor gallery in the location of where that church used to occur. The Sycamore Hill Baptist Church talked to the living descendants of the parishioners of that particular church to generate information and activity. And so today that is the monument to the church, to the parishioners that occupies a key location in Greenville and celebrates that history. So those are just a few of the themes. I think the first part in terms of thinking of memory and history is not the same thing, and how now both are being used in a weaponized way against us, and the need to start to counter those. And it offers examples of how different communities have attempted to do that through collective action, through transforming the physical environment, through organization, through other elements. But it's a great time to start to think about not just how the physical places are impacting us, but these stories and these false narratives are as well. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions or engage a dialogue that you want to have. Thank you.
Any questions?
I wanted to ask, how could I access that diagram that showed where all of or the number of monuments that there are in various places? Is that something you created or is it accessible somewhere?
Yeah, it's in the book, and I'm happy to share it with you. So I will make it available. I'll put it in a place where you all can share it and disseminate it but yeah, that was a graphic that was made for the book to make that point.
Thank you. Oh, very, very great presentation. Of course, the white man is the devil, and he's just trying to put himself all over everywhere. So even just the perspective of them honoring their people. I mean, really, the current presidency and a lot of his cabinet, they all just descendants of the same people who, if it was up to them, we'd all be enslaved and the monuments of their heroes would be all over the place. So I've been also happy to see a lot of them coming down in various places. But unfortunately, there's still plenty of them there. So probably as long as the whites are in America, they're gonna have their monuments up and be fighting for them. So it's good to know where they are, but we got to keep fighting to get them taken down for sure.
Ashe. Baba Easy.
So thank you, um, Dr. Thank you, Doctor, for a tremendous presentation. Definitely quite timely. So I guess my question is, I didn't realize that there was that whole concept of the silent century. And so have you seen any data points pointing to folk feeling like this is the rebirth of the nation? And am I not correct in that a former Confederate Army base that the name was changed back? And so maybe they're viewing this as their rebirth of the nation. I don't know. What's your thoughts?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think you're the only real doctor here, doctor. So you're the doctor. Uh, I think a couple things. One is, I've heard somebody talk about it as the Cold Civil War, which I thought was interesting. So when you think of a Cold War as versus a hot war, like the hot Civil War occurred, over a century ago. But when I started to learn a few things, and North Carolina plays a role in this as well because Andrew Johnson, who became president, and was integral to dismantling a lot of the things from Reconstruction that could have benefited our community. So he was the one who decided, or he was a part of the decision making of not to prosecute former Confederates, but allow them to come back into the Union without any trial. He was the one who overturned the decision regarding land tenure. So, if you've ever heard of the 40 acres and a mule anecdote, um, most of our people didn't get 40 acres, didn't get a mule. But the land that was seized, that was supposed to be repatriated, regiven to the newest citizens, African Americans, it was Andrew Johnson who said, no, we're giving that money back to the white folks we took it from. And the Great Compromise unleashed Jim Crow. The end of Reconstruction was really about votes. It was they wanted to get reelected, and they knew they couldn't get reelected as long as Union soldiers were occupying the South. And in the trade for removing Union soldiers, they got the votes so they could stay in office. So that whole pattern of our communities and our people being uh, uh, continuously seen and viewed as property has not changed since the Civil War for sure. But to get to the other point that you were making, the first one was the Cold Civil War. The second one, uh, I've lost the second one. Could you restate the second question that you asked? I'm sorry.
No, just in the move to, tear down these monuments and these symbols,
Yeah.
one of my thought was renaming.
Oh, yeah. Okay. I remember now. I remember now. Yeah. So Fort Bragg, right. So that's North Carolina thing too. Yeah, I'll bring that up. So Fort Bragg was renamed Fort Liberty under the Biden administration. Fort Bragg was named after, is the largest army base, I think, in the country, in Fayetteville, North Carolina. Bragg was a Confederate soldier. So people who went through that, even though we have, won the Civil War ostensibly, and the Federal Army is the Union Army, right? The base was named after essentially a traitor, someone who tried to overthrow the government, and somehow everybody was cool with it. under the Biden administration is renamed Fort Liberty. But one of the immediate actions that occurred under the Trump regime was the renaming it in terms of Bragg. Now, here's where the little bit of sleight of hand is. It's not the same Bragg. It's a different Bragg, right? So it's not named after the Confederate uh, officer that it was initially named after. It's named after a different Bragg. But it's sort of like a wink and a nod. It's sort of like, it's sending us again that sign, that symbol of a retrenchment of a different way of thinking about things, and a repudiation, really, of everything that came after the civil rights movement.
Thank you, brother.
My sister from Assad, I can't pronounce your name. Can you pronounce your name? Excuse me.
Nozibile, you can go ahead
Hi.
and.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. I was driving. Nosabelle Osset. That AST is Osset. I was just wondering because I grew up in Richmond. I'm from Virginia, and I remember Monument Row, as they used to call it. Those
Mhm.
monuments were huge. I don't think people really underscore or really. I want you to talk about why a lot of those monuments were larger than life, right? And the psychological effect. I know you talked about it in terms of intimidation, but I wanted
Mhm.
to know if you could say a little bit more about that. And in addition to the monuments, I don't know if your book touches on the Daughters of the Confederacy that was also on that same street,
Yes.
which is a huge building with a huge metal door,
Yes.
with all these spikes sticking out of it. So, do you touch on that in your book at all?
Yeah, thank you for the question. It's touched on several times. If you're interested, the first part it's touched on is by Blair Kelly, who's a public historian. She leads the public history program at UNC Chapel Hill. A Black woman whose mother is from Richmond. So one of the early chapters in the book is Blair grew up in the North, but her mother's from Richmond. And when she was a little girl, her mother used to give her a tour of Richmond and really talked about where it was safe to go, where it wasn't safe to go. And she spends a lot of time talking about Monument Avenue and how big that was. Richmond was conceived of as the capital of the Confederacy. So, in terms of how big those monuments are, it's almost like it was going to be their Washington, D.C., the equivalent to that, but for the Confederacy. So, one reason why they invested so heavily, even though they lost the Civil War, that it was a show of defiance that was about the symbolic role that Richmond was going to play if the Confederacy had moved forward. The Daughters of the Confederacy, for sure, reappears multiple times in the book. C.L. Bohannon, who is an associate dean at University of Virginia, has a pretty extensive chapter where he's examining the transformation of Monument Avenue, particularly after they added the Arthur Ashe Monument, which at that time was like the smallest monument on Monument Avenue. But the contrast between that and then the Lee Monument, he spends a lot of time talking about that. So yeah, Richmond plays pretty favorably. The other part I wanted to bring up was Blair has an excellent book called Black Folk, where she talks about working class in the early 20th century Black communities. And in what she wrote about Richmond and Monument Avenue and her experience as a child, she also talks about the importance of the Black streetcar workers and their union at that time, and Black media, Black newspapers, that in some cases we are mistaken if we think that Black folks at that time were just tolerating all this stuff. They didn't have anything to say about it. They weren't fighting to remove it even 100 years ago. So she did a really important job of connecting us to that tradition that through newspaper articles, through notes and union meetings, through other things, it was very clear that even immediately after they were created, there was a resistance movement brewing to try and take them down even then. So
And I'm so excited about this book. And I am definitely going to purchase it. And I have one more question about Virginia Union, about how they memorialized it. As first, I think it was a slave holding or slave jail, or a jail for enslaved people. that they eventually turned to Virginia Union. Do you all talk about
Mm.
that also?
We did not talk about that, so that's something that we did not get into the book, but that's something that's very important to the history of Shore.
Yeah, it's like the local HBCU there, and I think that's important.
That's incredible. That yeah, that the former okay, yeah, that could be the next book, I guess. Yeah.
Obe.
Hey, what's up, brother? Uwe, good to see you out here, man. Haven't shared space with you in a minute. Glad to see you out there. That was a good presentation. The book sounds good. I'll pick up a copy, I'll swim in it, and then I'll call you one day and ask you some questions about it. My question right now, though, is it seems like the moment of time, the Black Lives Matter moment, the anti-racist moment that saw Confederate monuments being pulled down, that time is over for right now. Does your text dive into the MAGA movement, the Donald Trump moment that we're in, this anti-DEI moment where we're not going to see removal of any of these white supremacist statues for at least another half of a decade? What you guys think?
I appreciate that, Baba. And I'll say to you and to Sister Nozabele, I will make the book. I'll send a link to the book. Y'all don't have to buy it, is the point I want to make. So I'll send a link to all the contents of the book. And so the brothers and sisters that came at Asen and Aset, you can help yourselves and just get it for free. So um, uh, I'll make it available. But that's an excellent question. I would say that we started this book before the pandemic. Uh, and like you said, we're in a different reality now. The introduction that I wrote really talks about the coded language that Trump used in his first campaign, and particularly his response to the Unite the Right and Charlottesville incident as a way of describing that change in tone. So it was before this second term and what's been happening since then. But we tried to get at that there was even language. For example, like as soon as it happened, he jumped to there are good people on both sides. There's a whole diatribe where he talks about, well, if uh, George Washington and Thomas Jefferson owned slaves, does that mean we need to take that in their monuments too? Like, so it was pretty clear even in 2016 and 2017 that he was dialed into these particular themes and topics even back then. In which case, all of us on the call would be like, well, yeah, that does mean that you need to take those things down. But unfortunately, it's a moment in time, and we did not pick up on that. In terms of resistance to these monuments, what we also didn't really fully address was around the world. In the United States, it was Confederate, but around the world, it was anti-colonial. Um, that people were pulling down statues in different cities, and the same ire that we had towards the Confederacy, they had towards their former colonial masters. And so, a thought is that the global side of it probably is still alive for now. In this country, though, just as you said, the penalties are really strong. Uh, we didn't get into the politics of Black Lives Matter movement that much in the book, um, but we can say anecdotally that that was not a Black movement. If you looked at who was out in the street and who was doing the work, those weren't Black people. It was unusual in that most of the people that were out there doing this were white folks. And I think that actually contributed to the strength of the backlash that we're facing now, is that older white folks saw their kids out there and they freaked out. And it's led to this overcorrection, so to speak, about that. Because I think if we were the ones that were out there doing it, it'd be business as usual. But I think that the fact that they saw their own daughters and sons out there in the street under the auspice of, speaking out against the murder of George Floyd, of a Black man, that rattled them to their core. So in a way, I kind of see it like from Obama to Black Lives Matter to now is all this is like the other end of that pendulum swing in a way to try and overcorrect. But I think the pendulum will swing back. So I think that it's a matter of keeping some of the stories and some of the energy alive until that we get the moment again to see some momentum.
Yeah, that's how we live our life, right? The
100%.
arc of the moral universe. Can I get one more, Kazi?
Yeah. Go ahead, Bob.
So, brother Uwe, white supremacists have literal statues of their heroes. It seems like you were saying part of the counter reaction to that was I think I saw a sister dancing in a like a presentation, a graphical representation of something having to do with black folk. Brother, ain't that kind of esoteric? You got a statue of a white Confederate general. Wouldn't a counter reaction to that be a statue of a black hero from the Confederate Army? What you think about that?
Yeah, I think it's powerful, Baba. I think it's funny because whenever you get into it, I start having PTSD from the crossing. So I want to agree with you. So I'll just say I agree. No, I think there's a lot of ways to deal with it. I mean, I think the early part of the talk was really about when I didn't put it into words, but this idea of memory was really that time in Ghana and being in that horrible place, Cape Coast Castle,
Yes.
but also the fact that it almost needed to remain in order for it to serve its role as sort of like a cautionary tale for future generations if this could happen, if the moral
Right.
arc shifts again. But the living memory and the living memorial of the resilience of the Fanti people that in the face of that, they could have gotten smashed out by colonialism. They could have stopped their practices. They could have stopped all their stuff. Not only did they not stop, they just kind of kept it moving and they kind of overran this old symbol uh, of colonial oppression. And so, I'm of two minds. I agree with you about like you counter with the same symbol, but I'm wondering if, from an African centered point of view, there's a different way of memorializing and symbolizing that's more about the ritual in some
Right.
ways. So, like the indicator is like healthy Black people. The indicator is like Black leadership, Black consciousness, Black presence of mind, Black excellence. And so, if a monument helps to make that happen, I'm for it. But I think there are probably a lot of other things we could do as well to make that occur.
Yes, sir. Good work. Good work.
Yeah, I have a quick question and comment. My first question is, this not symbols, but how European memorialize themselves. So, I live in the DMV, and then I found myself driving on a highway, and the highway said Jefferson Davis. I didn't, it didn't hit me until it hit me, and how, I kind of got PS, emotional, fearful, all these emotions came up and mad. So I think it's important that we understand that these Europeans, as Ayatollah said, that they memorialize their heroes and they put them in our face as a form of terror.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's really important. And the second question, that's just a comment. My question is that the the fort in is it Alameda in Cape Coast, Ghana?
Yeah.
How do we? I guess two things can be true at the same time, right? For the brothers and sisters in the continent of the continent, this is just a place where they conduct business. For us,
Mm-hmm.
it's a place of the beginning of the Mayafa. So how can
Mm-hmm.
we, without having us versus them, that we are all the same people?
Mm-hmm.
How is that possible? Is that even possible for us not to be? Because I did get emotional when I saw them just fishing, but at the same time, they have every right to just keep moving on. So is it a way that two things can be possible?
It's a great question. I grapple with that a lot. And luckily, uh, had people that were willing to talk about it. When I first started going to Ghana, and so the first time I went was 2005, and the only people in Cape Coast Castle were tourists. There were no Ghanaians in there other than the people that were guiding the tours. Like you didn't see kids, you didn't see school groups, nothing like that. And when we used to talk with the young, particularly the young Ghanaian brothers and sisters, uh, just like we don't know as Black Americans all the nuance about what they experienced under colonialism, they had no idea about slavery, like none, zero. So it was interesting having a conversation about it across the diaspora in terms of how do you share the experience of, having been oppressed at home versus being completely removed from your home place. Um, my last time in Ghana was 2014, and when I went to Cape Coast Castle, there were a lot more Ghanaian school groups going through. And that actually gave me a little bit of hope, as much as it doesn't sound like it. But the idea that there seemed to be a concerted effort over those years to kind of bridge that understanding gap of saying that from like a Fanti perspective, if you were there 1,000 years and if that castle was there for like 300, and the castle hasn't been doing what brought its infamy in over a century, is just like a chapter in the book. And so, you just kind of keep it pushing. But the fact that there seems to be an intentional effort to use the message that they were sharing with us to share it themselves as a step to understand kind of what we went through as a part of that. And I think the other part is true too, with regards to colonialism. I don't think we fully understand what it means to be dominated in your own land. The thing that shocked me multiple trips to Ghana was the British, the Anglo-Asante Wars, and what the Asante people had to do to compromise in order to maintain their cultural traditions. So basically, what happened was the British said, "Give us all your gold and diamonds, and we'll let you keep your chiefs and your kings and all your traditions, but we get the gold and diamonds forever." And they did. They made that compromise to keep their cultural traditions, but at the expense of their economic power. And it wasn't until Kwame Nkrumah leads the independence movement in 1957 where any of that kind of gets rewritten, and then he's exiled and never returns to Ghana. He dies elsewhere. So there are compromises that have Ghana and other parts of the diaspora in some difficult conditions and getting snatched back up into neocolonialism in some ways that I think are part of the rest of the world not fully understanding what they went through um, and why it's difficult within that system to see pathways moving forward. So I think we have a lot to teach each other. We just have to find more settings and forums where we can come together as family and actually have those conversations.
I actually had another comment. So earlier when you were mentioning,
All right, Toro, I think I seen the queen had her hand up first, Baba.
actually she already spoke, but I can't find the icon to raise my hand. So, but if she has to speak, she can speak after I spoke. But she spoke already, so I want to say something.
Wait a minute. I'm about to speak now. Thank you.
No, I can't
couple
raise my hand, but I would have had my hand raised after you spoke the first time.
Oh, okay. So you want to go ahead? My comment was really quick, though.
Okay.
All right, thank you. So I just wanted to say to the brother, I think his Isaiah is in the DMV area. I know this topic is so important because it's so layered. In Virginia, we have Lee Jackson Day, which is the day before MLK Day, right? So they celebrate those things in tandem, right? And then I think after Baba Ayatoro talked, I think it's something to be said about how I think a lot of times people hold a lot of space for Africans to feel a certain way about us. And a lot of times we don't realize that we didn't the process of our dehumanization and the systematic way that they tried to break us down made us into something else. And even at the time, people in Africa didn't see themselves as one people. There was no Africa. There was no Ghana per se, right? There was no Togo per se, right? So you had
Yes.
a loose confederation of people who saw themselves as these different groups that made it possible for them to send us into those types of conditions, right? And whether we like to realize or whether we really like to wrestle with that fact or not, because sometimes it is complicated and sometimes it can be a bit emotional, a lot of those slave monuments and the castles were converted after the fact, right? And in some cases, it was converted after the fact when some people realized that that can be a tourist destination. That could be a way of making money. So when we go there to the castles, we have a different experience with it, and we can't expect them to have the same experience or yeah, that we can't expect continental Africans to view it the same way.
That's a great point.
So can I speak now?
Yes, yes, Baba, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Uh, what I wanted to say was, you mentioned how much of a challenge it may be to have the monuments continue to come down here. That's actually a good conversation I want to have with one of the brothers in the town. One of the brothers here, his name is Mawuli Davis. So he's like a civil rights attorney, and he was one of the people who was advocating for, I think, some monuments in Decatur, so like on the eastern suburb of Atlanta. So he was working with them. But I want to ask him about that. But what I actually wanted to say more prominently is Burkina Faso, from what I know, is an example of the international side of getting rid of their version of the Confederacy. So I believe that the foolishness around wearing these white wigs, the judges wearing white wigs, I think that they were doing that in Burkina and they stopped. And then also a lot of names of French roads and French buildings, and I believe even the French military. So it's like Burkina, from what I know, is getting rid of a lot of that, a lot of those things, and beginning to do, have some self-determination. And I really, I hope to be able to go there. I mean, I don't speak French, so that's going to be interesting, but I definitely look forward to being there and being on the ground and seeing some of the actions that he's doing. But from an international side, it seems he is definitely in the forefront within his country of showing other Africans what to do, because there's, millions, if not billions, of resources that are coming out of our spaces. We're dependent upon the World Bank and the IMF. When if these colonizers weren't stealing and we weren't selling, or being sold out or whatever, there's a lot of stuff that we can do in our international spaces while we try to figure out what we can do here locally with the current foolishness that's happening in Washington. So I just wanted to contribute that.
Thank you for that. Thank you for both comments. Yeah, I think yeah, points well taken. We have a lot to do.
Are there any other comments at this time? Questions, concerns?
Baba, just one question. I mean, so this one is the era of the Empire Strikes Back, and
Mm,
the question is, to your point on the how to keep the fire burning as the pendulum has swung. I
mm.
don't know if there's like a part two conversation about how do we keep the fires burning as the empire is raging.
Yeah, I think that would be a really good part too. I mean, I think, and this is, I mean, the grand scheme of things, like a monument or a memorial is a smaller thing when you're dealing with the level of, of really going back to Jim Crow, just straight up in terms of the erasure of the whole uh, anything dealing with civil rights. Want to believe that people are going to get smacked into their senses and decide to stand up and fight that, but it hasn't been happening. I think this is just not scientific, but just a personal opinion. Is that what we're really experiencing is the impact of so much misinformation and disinformation, and targeting people, vulnerable people, and feeding them the wrong information, so that when they're in a position to make a decision, they're making wrong decisions. And when danger is coming, they don't see the signals coming. So I feel like education, as much as it's slow and it's boring to some people, is the thing. Like literally deprogramming people and helping people be able to discern fact from fiction and to think critically. And I think uh, the folks on the call and the folks in NASEN are really well positioned to help with that. Um, I think that it really is a matter of, in some cases, people just uh, they've been programmed, they've been brainwashed into thinking things that aren't true and into believing things that aren't true. Um, and I think we can do a lot more just to help people with that critical thinking piece, so that when they're faced with this stuff, they're responding in a proper way. I mean, when so many people didn't, the whole election thing, it's not saying one election caused all this, because this was a long time coming in terms of this pendulum swing. But the number of people that I interacted with that I thought um, were paying attention and were well informed, revealing that in fact they weren't, that they were getting bad information from social media, they were responding to hearsay, they were making decisions on things that just really didn't matter, was really shocking to me. So I feel like it's really highlighting how much more work we got to do in the value space, in the critical thinking space, and in the decoding misinformation space. So there are other things that could happen, but that seems to be like a top one.
Yeah, I would also like that, and that's real important to really study and keep the flame burning in this time of darkness. And I just wanted to comment that I just found your presentation to be so profound on a lot of levels. Excuse me, and that how I learned this information, but I learned it from different scopes, and learning it from a architectural point of view is profound because I learned maybe the cinematic way of what Birth of a Nation did, also a historical way. So I just want to thank the Baba for his presentation, and the scope was real important. So I urge, there's all of us on this call to keep the fire burning and not to get discouraged, and to really, huddle in, hold each other hands, and just keep on, as the Baba Ize said, doing the knowledge, right? So we have to keep, pushing this information, because it seems like soon they're going to make information contraband, right? So we just
Mm-hmm.
have to understand that we have to stand on our square and really push out and do more of these forums and more of this upliftment. So that's just my last 2 cents. And thank you, Baba, for this presentation. It was really amazing.
Thank you, good brother. Thank you to Dasin. Thank you to Aset. Thank you to everybody. I'm honored that the Queen Mother came as well. It was a treat, and I wish all of y'all well.
With that said, I'd like to thank everyone, and look, we should be having another Chemist Speak in April or May. And thank you all, and peace and blessings.
Thank you so much, good brothers. Tremendous, tremendous.
Thank you. I'm Johnson.
I'm Johnson up. Peace.
Johnson and
Good job, bro. Good.